Okay, so we'll move on to the subject matter at hand, taking notes. This is the land acknowledgement we use at Simon Fraser University. We have three campuses, and they're all on Coast Salish lands, but different Indigenous nations. Right now, I'm working from home, and it's the land of another Coast Salish nation called the Kakite. If you're so inclined, you might drop something into the chat about what nation you're on, or I know that in some provinces you'd say that you're on treaty number, whatever number land, and I'm kind of interested to see that. Oops. All right, so we'll see how far we can get with this outline. We'll have a discussion about the purpose of note taking because that really informs how you take notes, or it should inform how you take notes. We'll talk about notes from lectures and from readings, and some possible formats of notes and how to get the most out of the notes that you take. And yeah, I mean, it would be like absolutely lovely if you're all able to stay around for the entire time. But if any of you have to leave early, that is completely fine as well. So I'd like to start, with a bit of a discussion about the purposes of note taking. Like what do you think the purpose should be when you're taking notes from your reading or from your lectures? And feel free to unmute yourself and say something or to put something in the chat about it. Wow, we have 12 participants at this point. I had no idea there were so many people here. Mm. Okay, there's something in the chat. So Fatima says it's a good way of keeping record of your learning for upcoming tests. So there's a bunch of things coming in. Summarize the main idea, summarize my understanding. Yeah, I like what's coming in, um, because it's all about sort of summaries, main ideas. I like the word understanding, so it's not just simply recording what you're hearing or what you're reading. Um, Memorize, like writing in the brain. I don't know. I mean, there are some things that need to be memorized, but I think it probably is more about understanding and processing the information. Um, yeah, so one of the resources I really like, that's external to my university and all of yours probably, is a video series on how to learn material deeply. It's by a professor of cognitive psychology. So his specialty is about like thinking, learning, the whole mental processes. And in one of the videos, he talks about the purposes of note taking this way, that it is about summarizing, which a couple of you explicitly said, memory cues. So the last comment about memorization, I guess it's kind of getting at that. Um, and then I really picked out the word understanding, and that goes to the third purpose is helping you process and engage with the material. So it shouldn't be a situation where like your paper or your laptop knows a bunch of stuff, but you don't. It's kind of like a tool to use in thinking about the information that's coming in. And finally, I think that one I've added on myself is to help you develop note-taking skills. Um, I'm really big on having a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset. And that has to do with like just realizing that just because you can't do something right away, it doesn't mean you can never do it, right? So some people will enter university and say, "Oh, I'm a student, so I don't really have to work really hard or whatever." Or they might say, "I'm not university material. How did I even get in?" But really, both of them can succeed, and it just sort of depends on what they do from here on in. And it's the same with note taking. I've had students say things like, I'm not good at taking notes, so I just don't. Or I can't take notes unless the professor provides notes. But it's this whole practice makes perfect situation. Like if you're having trouble taking notes effectively, really the best thing to do is to take notes. Because if you are trying it, you're practicing it, maybe you're reflecting on how effective the notes were, how you could make them better. And of course, attending sessions like this and learning about note-taking strategies, your note-taking will improve. What is not here that some students might think, and I have no evidence from your suggestions that any of you think that this should be the purpose, which is a good thing. But I think some students are just always scrambling to take down as much as possible. So some of the struggles I hear about are, I'm trying to like take down as much as possible. And because of that, I am not really catching what the professor is saying next, so you miss a lot of things because it's all about taking down as much as possible. And I really think that isn't the purpose. Like I think really a summary and having some sort of cue and using it to process the information, that is more the purpose. Um, but if you're distracted by trying to take down everything, then it takes away from the purpose. So let's keep that in mind as we go along. Um, I'd like to propose that, oh, and before I propose anything, I think we have a question or something. Oh, just a comment. Okay. Danuka, I prefer to take down examples that the professor gives so it helps me remember the concept and the idea later on. Yeah. Yeah, examples are good. Um, because it explains it. And the next step is maybe going from the example the professor gives to trying to think of your own examples. Maybe examples in your personal life if you're taking a subject like education or psychology. Maybe examples from current events if you're taking political science or economics. It's always good to kind of think of other examples, even if they're just hypothetical that you make up, because on tests you might be, seeing new examples and have to like sort of discover the commonality between the examples you've been given. So it's a good thing to practice as well. Okay, yeah. So what I'm proposing, I will propose something, um, that I think it's good to integrate all of your notes into one document. Um, so not having, say, three separate sets of notes if the professor provides notes, and then maybe you do the readings and you take notes, and that's entirely separate from the notes that you take in lecture, like whatever order you do it in. Um, because if you have a set of notes going into the lecture and you have it, handy and able to like add notes to, um, then it's going to help keep you on purpose. Um, in that you're not trying to write everything down, you're not trying to summarize, like you are more focused on summarizing things. You're going through the notes that are in front of you as the professor is speaking. Probably you don't have to write very much down, but you might occasionally write a little bit more detail. You might write a clarification if you didn't really understand something earlier. Um, and it can just really, do a lot to keep you listening and mentally engaging if you're not trying to write down too much. Or say you did it the other way around. Say you went to the lecture first. A lot of people will complain that it takes too long to take notes from readings. But if you come to your readings with the notes already in place, then, while you're reading, there might just only be a few things to add. And I see we did have another comment in the chat. Isn't it better to have separate notes from readings and lectures to avoid mix-ups, repetition, and then integrate them better into a separate document with similarities? I mean, some people might prefer to do that. I do think that repetition is more likely to happen if you have separate documents. I've seen sets of notes where something is repeated 3 times, right? And that doesn't seem to be particularly efficient. If you're worried about, keeping track of where material comes from, you could have a system for flagging, like what is lecture material, what is reading material. And if there's some sort of contradiction between them, it becomes more obvious if you're taking them in one document and then okay, wait a minute, it's conflicting and I can just go and try to clear it up. Um, But I mean, obviously you're not going to necessarily take all the suggestions that I'm giving because this is all subject to your own experience. Like you're all experimenting as learners, you're all thinking about what's effective for you personally. But this is a proposal. This is like if what you're doing so far doesn't work, or maybe you think it could work better, something to try. So the question is, if you are like working on one document of notes, or even if you aren't, um, which do you do first? Oops, sorry. I'm trying to get to the chat again. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so you can put in the chat or, just say if you think it's better to do the readings first or to go to lecture first, or whether it depends and why you think that. I'd be interested in finding out what you think about that. Oh, thank you, Fatima. The question is, it's basically what's on the slide. Do you think it's better to do your readings first? Do you think it's better to go to the lectures first? Or does it depend? Or, and then just to justify your answer or provide the reasoning behind your answer. So Janelle says going to the lecture first to get an idea of what to pay attention to while reading. I'd like to, see other opinions. I hope somebody else is typing. But I mean, what Janelle says, like it definitely can make sense to do that. It just depends on the circumstances. Well, my own answer is that it depends. And it might surprise you that I'm saying that because I think probably a lot of you have heard from people saying always do the readings first to be prepared. But yeah, like sometimes I think Janelle's approach can be the right one. Um, so let me explain a little bit further. I think like the advantage of doing the reading first, the primary advantage, what I see is that for one thing, a lot of the time professors are expecting that you'll have done the reading first. And so they're going to be pacing their lecture that way. And they might not explain some really basic concepts that, you because they're just sort of assuming you will have gotten the basic explanation in the readings. But if it's not something that you know already and you haven't done the readings, then you could kind of be left in the dust. And similarly, um, reading is something that you can control the pace of a lot more than you can control the pace of a lecture. Like you can't control how fast a professor will talk, almost at all. Sometimes, if you ask a question or you ask a professor to repeat something, then, maybe you have a little bit of control over it. Um, but, for the most part, the professor is just doing what the professor does. And if it's going too fast for you, then you can be left behind. Reading, I mean, I know nobody wants to spend a huge amount of time on the reading. You might have external time pressures, but leaving that aside, you can set aside as much time as it's going to take you to understand it. Um, And and that's what we're going for when you're reading. We're going for retention and understanding. And sometimes that gets lost with, somebody just trying to read really, really quickly. Um, Especially if English is not your first language, or if it's like a bunch of technical words, that even someone who is an English as a first language speaker would be challenged to understand. It can be really, really important to be able to control the pace of the first time that you're getting that information. Um, so I think, in a lot of cases, it's better to do the reading first. However, I do get Janelle's point about getting a sense of things in the lecture and then, taking your notes from the lecture and doing the readings and letting the lecture notes kind of assist you in understanding what's going on in the readings. And I certainly, did that myself a lot when I was in university. Um, I think, some of it boils down to what your strengths are, and our profession has gotten away from like, oh, you have to learn according to your learning style. Like, your task is to be flexible and to learn according to the demands of the course. But I think in my case, like I generally was, somebody who grasped things quicker when I heard them as opposed to when I read them. And also it just depended on the skills of the lecturer. So, if I had a course where it was just a very straightforward lecturer who would really pace themselves and explain things clearly, and maybe the textbook was much more complicated and more difficult to understand, then that's what I would do. I would go to the lecture first. I would kind of get the simple explanation. I would go back and do the reading and let the lecture inform it. But a lot of the times, it's kind of the reverse. Like a lot of the times, given the pace issue, the reading is kind of easier to understand if you take your time than the lecture is. So, this is something just to kind of monitor as you go through your courses and figure out what is more effective for you in each situation. Um, I do think that, definitely you want to have some preparation when you go into a lecture. So if you don't do a full reading, you might at least want to, if there are notes posted in advance, look at those. Maybe flip through the book, look at, some of the headings, some of the bolded words, or like anything that kind of stands out, just to, have some sort of mental context that you can attach the lecture information to. All right. So we talked about combining notes. There are, numerous formats for doing that. So this is kind of the old school format, assuming you can print out the professor's lecture notes and take notes on the side. That's one way of doing it. Note-taking apps. There's a number of note-taking apps where you can actually pull up the slides, and whether it's on a tablet or a laptop, and you could use your stylus to write on the slides, or you could, make text boxes on the slides to type on. Um, yeah, and I have a daughter with dyslexia, and she has a laptop, and she finds that, making text boxes and typing things into the professor's slides is what works best for her. Yeah, and I think if you don't know how to do this, a lot of these note-taking apps will have YouTube videos about how to pull up slides and take notes into them. So the preparation, we kind of alluded to the preparation before when talking about reading. But one thing we didn't talk about is the sleep element. And I totally consider having a good night's sleep to be a great way to prepare for lectures. Sometimes those early lectures, either people don't attend, which I don't think it's in this particular workshop, but I do have a graph that basically shows the relationship between attendance and GPA, and it's a pretty direct relationship. Um, but sometimes people will attend, but they'll just be so sleepy that they're really not taking much in. Um, so How many hours of sleep do people think is a good number of hours to be like mentally efficient as a student? Just take a guess. 8, 7 or 8. Yeah, you're kind of all like 8 to 10. Yeah, you're kind of in the right ballpark. I think 8 to 10 is actually the most accurate, which is kind of crazy compared to what some students will get. Um, yeah, I mean, it's always tempting if you've procrastinated doing homework or something to do homework late at night. But there is like a lot of research that particularly people who are the traditional age of university students, so say 18 to 20 or whatever, um, need about 8 to 9.5 hours of sleep on a consistent basis. And there's also research that students who get that tend to do a lot better than students who don't get that. So it's preparation for lecture, but I mean, it's preparation for anything like tests, your problem solving ability, will decline without enough sleep, your memory, your concentration, your ability to, do all the things that you plan to do in the day. And you know what? Emotional regulation. So for those of you who just get incredibly anxious and that interferes with your school performance, like sleep can really help with that as well. Um, so yeah, so sleep is kind of a basic way to prepare to be efficient in taking information from the next day's lectures, the next day's readings. Um, but also, like we said, either doing the reading in advance or at least reading the professor's notes and making room to take your notes into it. At least flipping through and, maybe reading like even the first paragraph and the last paragraph or something from the readings so that you have at least a little bit of context. Another way is to reread your notes from the previous lecture because subsequent lecture may very well build on the previous lecture. So you want to refresh your knowledge so that you have that going in. So about, I guess it's 12 years ago, no, 11 years ago now, like 2013, 2014, there was a lot of research that actually was, it was getting into the regular newspapers and websites and everything about, is it better to take notes by typing? Is it better to take notes by handwriting? And I think since then, our understanding of that research has evolved a little bit. Can I get in the chat, what way people take notes? Like if it tends to be written, whether it's with a pen or with a stylus, or whether it tends to be typed, or or whether it depends. I just kind of like to see what's going on here. Mm, Pen and paper, computer, written or typed, depending on the course, tablet with pen. Okay, and I should have asked this originally, but if you can put like the reason why you prefer one method over another. Mm. And actually, I was as people were coming in, I was asking where they were from, and I got like, I think Laurentian was a big one, but I haven't asked most people, so I'm kind of curious if you wouldn't mind putting in where you're from as well as your reason for taking notes, how you do. Okay, so someone's saying faster when typing, less to carry around if it's a tablet with a pen, quicker to write on paper. Oh, that's surprising. I think a lot of people find it slower. It's interesting. Laurentian. Wow, Laurentian is like, I wonder if you're going to get the attendance award for the conference. There's so many of you. Writing on paper is convenient. Oh, wow. Gosh, Laurentian rocks. You know what's funny? My brother is going to Laurentian, and he's also a mature student, like person who's used to pen and paper. My brother is doing a business degree at Laurentian, but the funny thing is that he's doing it in Kingston, Ontario, through what college? St. Lawrence College. Yeah. Thompson Rivers University. Oh yeah, online. Well, if you're online, I think you've like maybe no choice. Retain information more with handwrite notes, less distracted handwriting than when using computer, also Laurentian. So that was Janelle. And I think I'm going to then go to talking about the studies because that's pretty much exactly what the studies that were done about 10 years ago said. There were a couple of different groups of studies, and one of them was, it was more naturalistic. It was studying people, in an actual lecture, and they could take notes however they wanted. And then they did a survey afterwards, and they also compared results on a test afterwards. And they were finding that the people that took notes on pen and paper and were sitting away from where they could see other people's screens were the most effective, both in terms of saying they weren't distracted and in terms of doing well on the tests. So the paper and pencil, the paper and pen without the distraction of seeing other people's screens. My daughter talks about that one, like seeing people shopping at Aritzia, seeing people, just sort of browsing scores of games. I mean, yeah, she finds she's distracted doing that, even if she's taking her own notes and not looking at things like that. But anyhow, the distraction factor definitely supports pen and paper, or tablet and stylus, as long as you're not like navigating to different things. So then there was another group of studies, like the one that is cited here, with Oppenheimer, and I actually attended a webinar where Oppenheimer was talking more about the research. Um, and those ones controlled for distractions. So it was more of an actual kind of experiment study where they were comparing people taking notes by hand and by typing, and the people that were typing were unable to browse to any other site. It was just the note-taking software that they could use. And so they kind of controlled for the distraction factor. Um, and the findings were still the same, that the people that were writing tended to do better on the tests than the people that were typing. Um, so the explanation that came up, there was somebody who shall remain nameless in the chat, who said something about typing being faster, and that's why they like typing. And that's when I give this workshop at SFU, I mostly hear that answer, like, oh, it's so much faster, I can get more down. But you go back to what I was saying at the beginning about the purpose of note taking, and that's one thing that isn't the purpose, getting more down. It's really about focusing in and picking out what's important and mentally, playing with what's important to achieve an understanding. And sometimes if you're typing super fast, you're not really doing that. Like it's more of it's going in your ears, it's going out your fingers. It might be bypassing your brain a little bit. And you really need to engage your brain. And one way of engaging your brain is kind of slowing yourself down. And I think, that's why they sort of found that writing could be effective because it slows you down. Like you can't transcribe everything. And so you're doing more thinking about what are the main points versus, things that you don't necessarily need to write. Um, so like right away, you're trying to kind of prioritize and organize the information. And if you determine that you need to write it down, the next thing you start thinking about is whether you can write it down in fewer words. So then that's really building your understanding because it's not just kind of like rote, I'm going to write down every word that I've been given. You're actually thinking about the meaning. Um, so can that be achieved if you're typing? It totally can. I mean, I mentioned I have a daughter with dyslexia. There are a lot of people that really can't be writing notes due to accessibility reasons. And what I told her is what I will tell you is that if you are typing, just slow yourself down and think about it. Think about what you're typing. Is this information that's a main point that I really need to record? Can I say it in my own words? And if you slow it down and you're doing that amount of processing, then you probably would be achieving similar effects as the people that are handwriting. Um, there is, I think a small factor of, actually making some sort of larger motions than just typing with your fingers, might, enhance learning to some extent, but it's mainly about to what extent are you processing the information. And writing can be kind of a cue to that. But if you're conscious of it, then, typing can also do that. And also what you do after the class, like reviewing the notes, possibly rewriting it in different words or coming up with questions or, noticing connections with other classes or other, areas of the class. Those will all enhance your note taking, however you've taken the notes. It's what you do afterwards. So, when we're saying like it's not about writing everything down, yeah, I mean, the purpose of note taking isn't about writing everything down. But also, if you think back about, we're saying have all your notes kind of in one place. If you are just adding to a set of notes when you're in class, then it's also unlikely that you'll miss very much. But even if you have missed some things that you wanted to write down, even just taking like 10 minutes after class and reviewing, if you have some time before your next class, you're probably still going to remember, oh, there's an incomplete sentence here. I remember what I was going to write down, and so you can fill it in. And it's even better if you have a classmate with you and you can, kind of talk about what was discussed and what different people thought was the most important points, fill in notes together. Um, and maybe if there's something that you realize you both haven't understood, you feel a little bit better about trying to get a clarification from the professor. Um, and also reviewing is the key to memory, so when you first learn something, if you don't review it within 24 hours, then it's just going to like be dumped from your short-term memory. So you do need to review it in the first day anyhow to transfer it to your long-term memory. So if you do a review shortly after class or as soon after class as you can to fill in any gaps, then that first review is done. Yeah. And then, if you review right away and you'll identify gaps really quickly, as opposed to like right when you're studying for the midterm tomorrow. And you can take measures to kind of clarify whatever you've missed. So this is something, that's often asked. What do I listen for? I mean, I remember what a gift it was when I'd be in lecture and the professor would say, "Oh, this would make a good exam question." So it's like, okay, sometimes they hit you over the head with what's important. Um, and I think quite often if you've done the reading and or read their notes, it kind of flags what's important. But sometimes you're just sort of paying attention to some of the nonverbal cues, some of the paraverbal cues with like all of a sudden they're speaking louder, they're speaking more clearly. So a lot of the time when they get kind of excited about information, like they'll be making more gestures with their hands, they'll be making lists, they'll repeat things, so just sort of tune in to body language and tone of voice and things like that. So let's shift gears a little bit to taking notes from the readings. And a lot of that actually has to do with reading strategies. Um, so I should, so I'm going to move my thing so you could capture the QR code if you want. University of North Carolina is a very good source of information about note taking. There's like all sorts of web pages about different formats and all sorts of things. But there's this very short video that they've made, and I'm going to stop sharing the slides so I can share the video. It's taking a minute. Just give me a minute and I'll share the video so we can all watch it together. It looks like we're going to have to watch a bit of an ad too, unfortunately.
That in 2024, the best way to make money with Amazon is not with physical products.
There are three major steps in taking notes from readings. Number 1, preview. Number 2, encode, that is digest while reading. Number 3, elaborate, that is deepen the encoding after reading. Previewing what you'll read is important because information sticks in your brain better if your brain has been prepared to receive the information. Doing so allows your brain to more easily organize the information coming in, and this in turn will help your brain to better remember the information. Here are some examples of how you can preview what you will read. Read through chapter headings and subheadings. Read through summaries. Consider questions listed in the chapter. Read through tables and figures. And most especially, as you look through the reading, ask yourself what questions you think the chapter will answer. The second step is to encode, in other words, digest the information you are reading. What you may not know is that the most common methods of taking notes from readings, highlighting and/or underlining, are not usually helpful for deeply processing the information. Most students highlight or underline too frequently and don't pause enough to actively think about what they're highlighting and why they're doing so. Research suggests that taking notes after you read short intervals of a text will help you more actively engage and therefore better remember the material. After reading through a paragraph or a section, stop. Then ask yourself, what are the main and supporting points? Write these down using the least number of words possible. If you have to write another paragraph to describe the paragraph you just read, you're not digesting enough. List these points, preferably in outline format, either in your textbook or, and this is my personal favorite, in a digital platform like Evernote. I prefer writing notes in Evernote, not only so that all my notes are within a few pages instead of dispersed throughout a textbook, but also so that I can review my notes whenever I want, since I can access Evernote from my laptop as well as from my smartphone. If you're still convinced that you should use highlighting, then highlight the least number of keywords to identify the main and supporting points. If you highlight a lot of text, it's a sign that you are not digesting enough. Using the method just described will decrease the need to reread in the future, making your reading time efficient as well as more effective in the long run. The final step is to elaborate on what you know in order to deepen the initial encoding. The key to doing this is to ask yourself a lot of questions. For example, is there another way of organizing the information which would make better sense? Would the information be better represented as a picture or a diagram, or perhaps as a table which shows similarities and differences between concepts? Would the information be better represented as a sequence, in other words, a series of steps? Does this new information relate in some way to things you already know? How so? What questions does the reading answer for you? What questions are still left unanswered? The more you think about concepts, the more likely it is that you will deeply encode the information, and the more deeply you encode, the better you understand and remember the information.
Hey, let me share the other thing now. Okay. So what they were talking about reading kind of a small piece and then taking notes on it, it's kind of like the 3R method, which is a method of reading. Um, and one of the purposes of the 3R method is to kind of avoid tuning out when you're reading. So I think probably a lot of you, and I certainly can admit to this, I've had the experience where I've been reading something and I look up and I've read 5 pages and I couldn't tell you what's on any of the 5 pages. So that's kind of one extreme if you're sort of reading too much. without pausing and checking your understanding by taking notes, you could just like completely blow past anything and turn your mind off while you're reading. The alternative is when people sometimes just take notes as they're reading, like you read a sentence, you're kind of highlighting at the same time, or you read a sentence, write something down. So it needs to be like a little bit of a longer interval, like a paragraph or something, or else you're just going to be writing down or highlighting too much. Um, so you read a paragraph or two, and then you look away and you're checking your memory and your understanding to make sure that you were focused enough on the paragraph. And if you weren't, if you can't say what it was that you read that was, like and highlight the most important points, then you need to go back and reread. But at least you just have to reread a paragraph instead of reading 5 pages that you tuned out on. Yeah. So you look away, you try to say the main points aloud, preferably in your own words. And I'm saying preferably aloud because if you say it aloud, it'll get in your ears as well as your eyes, so it adds kind of another medium. And actually, another reading tip is with these textbooks where you can turn audio on while you read it. That is that is insanely good. Like I would give that a try if you can, is read and listen to the audio at the same time. Um, but yeah, saying it aloud can really be helpful. But even if, like, you're in a silent study area and you can't do that, just trying to like take stock of the main point in your head. And only once you've done that, you write it down. And that will keep the notes, kind of focused. And keep in mind that while you're doing this, if you've been to lecture before, you may just be adding to some notes as well. Um, Yeah. And this was a big point in the video. And if you keep it selective, it's not going to be as tedious to take a bunch of long notes. Um, yeah. And maybe like writing some keywords in the margins, even in the margins of a textbook. So it's really quite legitimate to take notes in the margin of the textbook, either when you're reading or when you're going to lecture. And sometimes just having a word here and there, it can be a good memory cue. And on tests, you're going to have to remember the information. So, it's good to have some like incomplete memory cues as opposed to always having to read the entire thing. Mm. It's a little bit different, since I think so far we've been talking about if you're reading for, some sort of test. But if you're reading to like make an argumentative paper or participate in a critical discussion, something where you're having to take a position, it's a little bit more so, what you have to take notes on. So if, say you're trying to prepare for, a multiple choice short answer test, you're just kind of writing down things that the readings say, and you're not really questioning like what you think about it or if it's valid. You're just trying to learn the information. If you're writing to do an argumentative paper or something, then it's good to take notes also on what you're thinking as you go along. Um, to keep track of your thoughts, to keep track of arguments that you might be in the process of developing. Um, so it's kind of an added task. So the QR code here is like it goes to a pretty involved template for keeping track of like all your thoughts while you're reading for that kind of purpose. But I've simplified it down to just a 3-column template if you want the simple version. Um, so basically keeping track of your source in the first column, so that when you go back to do citations, you'll know where things come from. Um, and then in the second column, you would take the kind of notes that you would take if you were preparing for a test, just like what does it say? And then have a column for like what your thoughts are, so like what are you going to use this information? Like, I'm going to use this information in the section of my paper about justice. You know, you might write justice section, or you might write like, do I agree with this? Do I think that there is like an unstated assumption that the author is making that I don't agree with? You know, does it hold water? How does it compare with other sources I've read? You know, those kinds of things to keep track of. Um, and yeah, and if you want a more detailed version, it is at the QR code. And there is going to be a recording of this available afterwards at this same Zoom events link. So if you need to access it later, you'll be able to. Mm. There's another template also from Queen's University of Belfast, which I actually have visited, crazy enough. So that's an alternative one. Then other formats, and I realize we're running short of time, so if you need to leave, feel free. Um, really like using tables for taking notes. I'd say mainly for review notes when you go to study. So this is an example from a theory course. And it's just great to put like the theorists on one dimension and put the elements of their theories on the other dimension. And you could probably summarize an entire theory course on a single Excel table if you're doing that. I think another type of course that's useful for these tables are, say, literature courses, because often you will be getting questions about comparing different works of literature on the basis of their theme or their settings or, you know, whatever it is. So you can summarize that quite well in a table as well. You know, maybe when you're reading or when you're taking notes in lecture, you might want to jot down a really quick table, but I'd say, you know, it's primarily useful for exam preparation. A lot of exam questions are going to be about comparisons or relationships between different parts of the course. Another one that shows relationships really well is a concept map. I'm not going to say much here about how to make concept maps, but there is, you know, a reference to a tool for how to make them. And there's so many like online information and also even like apps you can use that will help you make the concept maps. But they're great for showing relationships. Also, you know, they could be a very quick and efficient way to write down things quickly in lecture. But on the other hand, if you look at it, there's just a few words here and there. So it becomes even more important to review your notes if you've taken it this way in the lecture, or else you probably forget what you're going to be what you're talking about. Cornell notes, I think that's another one that people hear about a lot, that people in my profession recommend. And it's about like either whether it's a lecture, whether it's readings, the main point is writing your notes just in, you know, the main part of the page. Maybe, you know, leaving room at the bottom to summarize what was talked about, you know, so that you're picking on out the main points. It's always good to try to pick out the main points so you're not trying to study everything later on. And we talked about learning from keywords, you know, like trying to remember things from looking at a keyword because you're going to have to remember things on the test. So there's room after the class when you do, say, your first review to put some keywords in the margin or to make up questions in the margin whose answers can be found in the main part of the notes. And then the next time you review your notes, you cover up the main part and you just look at the column with the questions and the keywords and you try to remember. It's also a really great format if you're going to give it to your mom later and ask your mom to quiz you. You know, it's somebody who doesn't know anything about the content can use this pretty easily to quiz you. And then what do you do afterwards to try to get the most from your notes? Keep them organized. This was something I was not good at doing in university. I would take some really great notes, but sometimes they would just be on pieces of paper on a clipboard, and then I'd put the paper somewhere and not be able to find it when I had to study. You know, so having like either an organized binder or, you know, organizing your folders on your computer or your tablet, you know, so that things are not just all over the place. It sounds kind of basic, but it was something I did wrong. So, just develop a routine of like after every class or after every time you've taken notes from your readings, you're filing it, probably would have like a folder for each class, and within that, like a folder for each week, maybe. And we've, talked about review, about how review is so important for memory. So far, we've talked about the first review on, the same day that you're learning something to move it into long-term memory. If you don't do that, you fall down, to about 50% knowledge on the forgetting curve, very quickly. You lose about half of it if you haven't reviewed in the first day. But yeah, and this is the curve of if you haven't reviewed, you lose 50% in the first day. And then a month later, if you still haven't reviewed, that's around when midterms are coming. You might know just a very small, like 5% or something of whatever you learned. And then you're like, oh, it should take only a couple of nights to study. And then, you very quickly you end up staying up late, running out of time. It's because you're not really studying, like you're not just reviewing at that point, you're trying to relearn all this information. Which takes a long time. Like memory is something that just always is needing to be refreshed. So, the alternative is if you review every week, every 10 days, you forget it a little bit, you reconstruct it, really the best type of review is maybe using those Cornell notes to try to reconstruct some things from memory. If you can't remember, you maybe look at it. So every 10 days or so, you're refreshing your memory. It's always hovering between 80 and 100%. And you get to the time before the midterm and you sort of know it. And then you have some time to practice applying it to questions, noticing connections between different parts of the course, and all those things that are going to lead to better performance, coming up with your own examples, for example. And the 10 minutes, 5 minutes, like basically what this is indicating is that the more you review, the less time it's going to take because you're more familiar with it. So you might say, I don't have enough time to do frequent review, but it's actually not as much time as you think it's going to be. Versus, say you take the cramming approach, it's going to be guaranteed a lot more time than you think it's going to be. So that's it. So it's yeah, time to leave. I'm so glad that we've had such a good attendance today. I would love to see in the chat, what's one big takeaway that you're actually going to try from this workshop. And like I said towards the beginning, these are suggestions. You know what works for you. Yes, Fatima, thank you. Thank you for being the first to respond. 3R method's great. But I mean, even if there's one thing that you can take away from this, it's worthwhile. I used to go to workshops when I was a student and I would forget about them like right after I left, so I think it's important, whether you put it in the chat or not, but to have, some sort of commitment that you write down, that you're going to try. Yeah. And Janelle saying reviewing notes every week. Fantastic. That should help as well. Yeah, Kaylee as well, review. Yeah, this is exciting. Okay, I'm going to let you go. I hope you have another session that you want to attend at 11. And thank you so much for coming to Procrastination Awareness Week. Have a good week.